Is my volume okay here?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
And let's see, here we go. Yes, sir.
You might want to turn yours up a little bit. You're a little soft-spoken to me, but
Yeah, let me just get out of this. And welcome to the program. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. And my guest is John O'Connor. He's the author of Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, covered up Watergate, and began today's partisan advocacy journalism. John, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
hey, it's great to be with you.
Now, John, I remember Watergate as being, I was only a kid at the time, but it was sort of my first political awakening and awareness. And I always found it to be extremely confusing and opaque, the way the Boston Globe would come out with these charts with all these pictures and intersecting lines and links. And you had Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Dean and Kleindienst and Mitchell and all the rest. And that it all went back to this burglary of the Watergate Hotel, which occurred before the election of 1972. And then after the election, suddenly it blew up around March of 73 with these two journalists from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, who have since gone on to great fame and have sort of created the hallmark for all journalism ever since, especially since they were enshrined in the movie All the President's Men. So your thesis is that this journalism, in that case, was sort of the beginning of what we would call advocacy journalism. So talk about that for starters, if you will.
Well, I think what happened here was the Post was forced, because of its alliance with the DNC, to be unusually aggressive against Nixon, who it hated anyway, but also needed to be protective of the DNC. And as I dictate in my book, as I state and prove, I think, the Post covered up many salient facts of Watergate. And what did it get for that very much untruthful but sensational and effective reporting? It got Pulitzer Prizes, movies, books, riches. The worth of the Post soared. It became a top flight newspaper from perhaps really a second tier newspaper. It was rewarded and became a political power to boot. It not only got earthly riches, it got political power. It was now an unaccountable fourth branch of government. So there are all these rewards, and at a time when, because of competition in the industry, staffing for investigations were actually going to be going down. We're going to be decreasing. So what do we have here? We have a situation in which the Post finds itself as a power. The Times tries to catch up, and we're off to the races. We now have, and look where we are today. We have a media that is not really doing much digging themselves, but they're certainly advocating a lot. And that's the real problem.
No, I think that we, the fruits of today, and you trace it quite well, go back to this corrupting element that went into the Watergate exposure. Now we have, especially since the election of Donald Trump, the standards have completely gone out the window. Now you have the big papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of the main, doyens of news, go out with stories based on one anonymous source, which would have been unthinkable even before Trump. And then, of course, once it's exposed and by President Trump as fake news, and he's usually right about that, it just simply they forget about it and move on to the next one, and it's just going on issue after issue. It's so negative and so openly partisan that I hope people see through that. But going back to the Washington Post, the Watergate break-in occurred before the election. It was not a big story. Why didn't they use that as a way to bludgeon Nixon? Because he went on to win a landslide election, 49 states.
Well, first of all, the thing didn't blow up in time, really, for it to affect the election. the big help with Mark Felt did not occur until the night of October 9th, 1972, right before the elections. There was a blockbuster article a day after, following up on the garage meeting of Woodward and Deep Throat.
Mhm.
So yes, it started opening people's eyes. The groundwork was laid with that article. People got interested. What became the Urban Committee was formed, but it really hadn't exploded. And I think, Charles, you correctly uh, fixed the date of the explosion as March of 73. And that's when what had occurred, what had the seeds that had been planted earlier sort of came to fruition then. So here's the way I look at this in terms of the reporting. If you give me a benefit like a contingency fee for winning a case, and I can go into a jury, into a courtroom without a judge and without an opposing lawyer, am I going to tell everybody in that jury all the truth? No, I'm not. I'm going to necessarily leave some things on the cutting room floor so I can get my verdict. So I get my verdict and walk out. And that's really what's happening today. As long as the partisan media can have some effect and they get their scalp, whatever it might be just a little piece of scalp. They've got it, they're happy. And so that's what we've got. They cater to their audience, they sell their advertising based on that audience, and there we are. So it is an odd thing that this whole thing did not explode until after the election, but today probably everything would have happened in about 3 minutes, like the Ukraine deal.
That's right. And the similarity, it seems to me, is that Deep Throat was not revealed his identity until I think it was in 2000s. I mean, when we find out it was Mark Feltz, and I think that was after he passed away. Um, and before we talk about him, I mean, I see similarities between that and the so-called Ukraine, the perfect phone call, where you have this so-called whistleblower who had heard third-hand information and who testified. To mention his name, I could lose my YouTube channel if I mentioned the name. It's a big hush hush, and we're probably not going to get to the bottom of that for another 10 years. But going back to the Deep Throat thing, I mean, in March of 1973, it seems like the whole thing happened because Nixon, who didn't even know about the Watergate break-in until he read about it in the Sunday paper, um, he was overly loyal to his cabinet members, and he engaged in trying to disengage them from any knowledge of it, and they lied about that, and that's why they were exposed. So what actually happened with that? What led to that the major shuffle in the administration, which was the beginning of the end?
Well, one of the odd things about Watergate was that Nixon did not know what had happened. He obviously had nothing to do with the burglary. And amusingly, he was upset that not so much that people would think he did something wrong, but that he did something stupid. It was so supremely stupid to break into the DNC when they had no information. But he always thought that it was one of his trusted people. He always thought it was Mitchell or Colson, Charles Colson, his hatchet man, John Mitchell, his former attorney general. And because of that, you are correct, Charles. He was probably unduly loyal to them and trying to protect them. In fact, Deep Throat thought who this must have been behind it. It must have been Colson or or even Mitchell or perhaps Haldeman. And that's a logical deduction. But in fact, none of that was true. It was really done off by lieutenants off on the periphery, joining up with the CIA. And the lieutenants off on the periphery were Jeb Magruder and John Dean. But Nixon didn't know that. And the Post led people to believe that this was a campaign operation. The only thing it had to do with the campaign is that the campaign had buckets load of cash to do this stuff. But it was really, Dean was interested in feathering his own nest for his future political ascent in the Nixon administration. Magruder, I talked in the book, had his own motivations, but mainly it was the CIA getting together with, I believe, John Dean.
And
for
the
their own bench.
CIA, the main point man there, I think, was E. Howard Hunt, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, right. And Howard Hunt was a supposedly retired CIA man who the Post knew was working for a CIA cover contractor, Mullen and Company. But they never told the readers that. They never told the readers that this PR agency for whom he worked half-time, and he worked half-time for the White House, the cover company was a CIA, was Hunt's employer, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
So if the public knew that, they'd say, well, wait a second, maybe if it's a retired CIA guy working for a cover company, maybe this is an undercover operation, which of course it was. But the public never knew that. I go through the book about how the public narrowly missed on many occasions learning the truth. But here, Nixon is kicked out of office without the public really knowing the truth. We all thought we knew. I was the biggest cheerleader for this reporting, Charles. I followed it. I was a pretty savvy guy and followed it closely. This was a big deal to me. I was a young prosecutor, young lawyer, and I was fooled. I don't blame anybody in the public for being fooled. And the terrible thing about it was there were crimes committed by Nixon, uh, counseled by John Dean, by the way. Uh, but nonetheless, he covered up. That's normal. If you were charged with a crime, you might do the same. We all might, especially it might be our family. We're covering up for our family, so maybe we don't
Mhm.
always tell the truth.
Well,
So it's
in
an
this
excellent
case, you might be implying the thesis of the book Silent Coup by Kolodny, who says that the whole thing comes down to Dean covering up the fact that his wife was a prostitute and, he wanted to, distract from that. I don't know. I mean,
well. I'm a good friend of Len Kolodny's. He and I have an active relationship, and we exchange notes, and he's a treasure trove of information. Uh, I do not subscribe to the point that his wife was a prostitute. I do, though, note that the article that impelled Dean to go in a second time looked like a leak from the Democrats that there was a lawyer at the White House that was involved in some shady deals involving escort services, a call girl ring. And so that's when Dean ordered them to go in the second time. So I kind of put this more at Dean than Dean's wife.
okay.
But he was there for his own particular purposes, that's for sure. And when the burglars got arrested, they were arrested because they were looking at a desk drawer that had nothing to do with the campaign. So I talk about it in my book.
Hmm.
Certainly, it all had to do with that call girl ring down the street.
Right. And since then, Dean has gone on to become rapidly anti Republican, particularly anti Bush and now anti Trump. And I mean, I get his tweets and his little mentions. I mean, it's extreme in many ways. So in '73, you had not just the breaking of of the connections to the Watergate break-in, but it was almost like a coordinated break of all sorts of other things that didn't look right in the Nixon administration. You had, the plumbers, you had the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, you had offshore banking by Vesco. There were all these other sort of peripheral scandals. And it seemed like it all sort of made the thing more confusing and more muddy than and just went to discrediting Nixon as a person and the whole administration. Was that part of the way this was reported? Was this part of a sense of really trying to take down the administration, or were these all legitimate issues that should have been brought up?
Well, the Ellsberg issue was legitimate, but as I state in the book, that is very clear, and I've got great support all across the spectrum on this, that the Ellsberg break-in was pushed and was primarily a CIA operation into which they conned the White House for its CIA's own purposes. They're the ones who started this. Uh, so that was legitimate, but if it was explained by the Post, the Nixon White House is really more the victim than the victimizer on that. But you are correct, Charles. The style of reporting was to just do a wall to wall sensationalistic reporting. You pick up the Post, and every page has got a picture, it's got something, it's got a big headline. And the Post scandalized the country with things that were very routine, like, oh my gosh, there were lobbyists who paid to help get the milk price supports. Well, that's standard Washington issue. I mean, why are we getting alarmed about that? But at the time, the public was not used to this culture of scandal. These sort of things weren't discussed. So the Post took advantage of that, and it just and the Nixon administration was besieged every day by this wall-to-wall coverage. But yes, some of it was legitimate, and I do think, by the way, that some of their motives for hiding the Watergate burglary, some of the motives stemmed from some of these things they were afraid to come out. You had the Ellsberg break-in, and then you had the Kissinger wiretaps, which were actually legal, but they're very sensitive. They were on newsmen and Kissinger's own staff. So they were sensitive about that. So it was
Right,
it was
right.
a witch's brew for Nixon.
And it reminds me in a way of the atmosphere around the Mueller committee when you had these daily bulletins. The Boston Globe would be sending me, bulletins on my smartphone. Oh my God, Stormy Daniels said X, Y, and Z. I mean, it was like, this is breaking news. I'm ready to have a nervous breakdown looking at my phone, and it's turned, and then the next day it's gone. And this constant drumbeat day after day of sensationalized stories, all couched in legitimacy and this negativity, this miasma of negativity that they tried to build and did build around Nixon, to the point where it led, as did with Trump, I would say, to Congress justifying the appointment of a special prosecutor, which was the beginning of the end. And that, in Nixon's case, was Archibald Cox, and then of course he fired Cox, and that led to the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. And you had I think was it William Ruckelshaus or someone who came in and finally took over. But wasn't that really the nail in the coffin, the appointment of a special prosecutor? And how did they justify that legally?
Well, let me say this. The appointment of a special prosecutor was one of the unforced errors of the Nixon administration. Why Nixon got rid of Kleindienst and appointed Elliot Richardson is beyond me. He thought that was somehow insulating himself by getting rid of Kleindienst. Kleindienst was pretty much uncontroversial, and the special counsel never would have been appointed. Once that happened, which was a condition that the Senate put on appointing Elliot Richardson, then the ball game was over. That was it. Once you do that, you're asking for it. Now let me bring that up to today. What they do is, Watergate is a template, and that's what I really say in my book. Notice that everything that happens today is derived from Watergate. Now, I would say today they do a Watergate without the underlying crime. There was no underlying crime that started the Russia investigation. It is a Comey crimeless case, but they do all the trappings of Watergate. They eventually stampede this milquetoast Rod Rosenstein into appointing a special counsel. But as I've said in different articles, and your viewers might want to go on my book site, postgatebook.com. And I'm saying this not to flack my book, but to flack the articles on the site, which explain this and about how the special counsel in the Trump case was not legally authorized. That's the funny thing about it, but it was all Watergate. Comey was hoping to get an obstruction. Remember, the lesson of Watergate was it was the obstruction that brought down the president. As they used to say, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. And so Comey is a master at starting crimeless cases, getting people upset so that they're going to do something stupid and obstruct, and then Comey's going to swoop in and get his scalp. And that's exactly what the Russiagate investigation was. It was never a criminal investigation. It was a counterintelligence investigation, which was supposed to be the president's investigation. He didn't know it. The Trump was kept in the dark. Comey fooled him. But everyone thought, and I think you and I both thought this. I thought that Russiagate had some criminal element to it. It did not originally. And therefore, it was not a, quote, criminal case. And there was no conflict for Sessions. Sessions never should have been recused. And there was no criminal case and Rosenstein had no statutory authority to appoint a special counsel because there was no criminal case. But Comey fooled everybody into that. So now we have a special counsel. Once that happens, the special counsel now has authority to go any place he wants. How does he prosecute Manafort, for example? I mean, okay, Ukraine's near Russia, but it has nothing to do with Russia in this case.
Right.
They went after Manafort. They went after Cohen for taxi medallions. The whole thing was just now
It's ugly.
an open shooting range.
Right. I mean, and it's an extraordinary power, and Comey has a long history of that, going back to the conviction of Scooter Libby for making some comment. I mean, he said it happened in March when it actually happened in April. Some silly thing and some process crime. And also, he put Martha Stewart in jail. So then he brings it up to, you've got his being fired, and that this was alleged. There's an effort to find obstruction of justice, and the Mueller group of brown shirts, not to use a pejorative, they convict people based on these process crimes, on these claims of perjury, and they show up with in the case of Roger Stone, 28 agents dressed in SWAT gear breaking down his door, and with a helicopter, and with CNN filming on the front lawn. I mean, this is an elderly man who'd never committed a crime in his life. I mean, it set a precedent in this country that I think is so ugly, and the fact that there were so many cheerleaders for this is so disturbing. But it shows how deranged the hatred for Trump is, I guess. But going back to Watergate, who was Mark Felt and who was Bob Woodward?
Well, Mark Felt was the number 2 man in the FBI, in effect, the number 1 civil servant, and was the leader of the Watergate investigation. His boss was Patrick Gray, who was a recent political appointee. The poor guy had just been in the job for a month when Watergate hit. So Felt was actually the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason he did what he did, and he really was not leaking so much as directing Woodward to be a mini FBI agent. Felt was very ethical. He did not just take stuff out of the file like Comey does today and just throw it out there to people and leak like a sieve. Felt never thought of himself as a leaker. He occasionally did leak a detail here or there, but he was not a big leaker. He was a director, a consultant, as Woodward said, a teacher. But what he cared about was preventing the FBI from doing its job. On orders from on high, Gray, through the Justice Department, was restricting the scope of Felt's investigation. And when I say investigation, Felt could investigate all he wanted, but he could only bring to the grand jury things that related to the 7 burglars. He couldn't go beyond that to other crimes he was uncovering. And that's what he wanted. He wanted public pressure so people would say, you mean there are other crimes out here? Let's investigate. And if Felt were allowed to do what he was supposed to do, he never would have gone to the garage with Bob Woodward. He probably would have had a couple scalps of young guys, perhaps Dean and Magruder eventually. And the thing would have been over and it would have been no big deal. But because they tried to restrict the FBI, Felt went into the garage. Once this happened, a can of worms was opened that Felt didn't realize was there, frankly, and none of the FBI people at the time knew. They didn't know about what the CIA knew. They didn't know about Ellsberg, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, again, an unforced error by the Nixon administration. They should have let the thing play out. Ironically enough, if Hoover had been alive, he never would have allowed a restriction of the investigation, and Felt would have never had to go to the garage. That's the irony of this whole thing.
Interesting. And then, of course, you had the revelation that there were tapes and that there had been bugging of phones and whatnot, something that now, I mean, has become almost routine in the Obama years, and that is eavesdropping and spying and whatnot. Yet back then it was a big deal, and it was a shocking scandal. Congress demanded the tapes, and that's what led to the resignation. Yeah.
Right. Had they not, now Nixon could and should have destroyed those tapes, obviously. He shouldn't have been so stupid to talk on them, but he got a tax deduction from those tapes for various reasons,
Oh
and I
my
go into
goodness.
it in my book.
Yeah.
And so he was loath to get rid of them because he saw himself living the rest of his life without paying income tax by donating his tapes, which were presidential papers. So that's why he didn't burn them originally. By the time it was clear that they would be produced, um, it was too late, and no lawyer would tell him to burn them because they were going to get prosecuted. So that would look like an obstructive thing at that point. Uh, and so he would have doomed himself. But he could have got rid of them earlier and said, "Look, I'm sorry, these are presidential papers. I don't have to give them to you." And he only would have had to burn 10 tapes, let's say. The rest could have been preserved. An interesting thing on this, Charles, is that the guy who revealed the presence of the taping system, Colonel Alexander Butterfield, a White House aide, he was probably CIA/DIA
Mm.
intelligence. He had infiltrated the White House as well and was in a good position to know everything. This was a guy on his way to be a general. He was movie star handsome, and all of a sudden he takes this menial job in the White House. What's that about? Resigns his commission, resigns, and that's probably intelligence protocol where he had to do that. So
So he was
uh,
spying on the White House for the
Right,
CIA.
right, right. He
Yeah.
was many, and McCord had sent contractors in when he was with the CIA. Had sent contractors in that he had lent to the Secret Service, and there's a good thought that those contractors had put listening devices throughout the White House. There was a
Yeah.
great distrust at the time, actually coming from the right of Nixon, not from the left, but from the right, that Nixon was too liberal on foreign policy, that he was doing all this stuff to taunt with Russia, the SALT talks, that he was going to do things with China. So the military establishment were very wary of Richard Nixon. And so there's an awful lot of spying on him.
Did Al Haig play a role in that, do you think?
Oh, yes. And that's where Len Kolodny's book is so
Mm.
fascinating. And he tries to link Watergate, of course, to this whole spying thing that had just been sort of bubbling up on the surface. There is a link. It's not as robust in my view as Len says it is, but it's what Len uncovered there was fascinating. So he uncovers a lot about Watergate too. So he uncovers both sides of it. Just in my view, I have a little different view of the linkage of the two. Uh, and he, I think, always thought the Deep Throat might have been Al Haig, and that this was all part of a military coup.
Hmm.
Um, I look at it really as actually it's a soft coup, as it turned out, from the Democrats.
And that's basically what happened. Nixon was forced to resign. Um, I mean, what about Nixon himself? Didn't he know what was going on? Didn't he try to take decisions that would expose this thing and extricate himself from it? I mean, he was a pretty savvy politician.
Well, he didn't know about this. He did know a lot. I mean, that's one of the interesting things is the Post probably hid this from Nixon. If the Post would have reported correctly, um, Nixon would have known more. And when Nixon did start suspecting the CIA, the Post went out of its way to say that that was just a false claim by Nixon. Nixon did not acquit himself well. I think he had no really good advisors around him. If he would have hired a really good outside lawyer, he would have avoided all this. He was relying on John Dean, who turned out to be
Yeah, not
highly
his
in
friend.
conflict. So the whole thing was a mess. There were so many, like I say, unforced errors here. He got no good legal advice, probably spiraled a bit, started drinking a lot, made very bad emotional decisions. So I could go through and I could tell you about 10 decisions that I, as a lawyer, would have said, no, don't do that. Don't do this, don't do that. And
Right.
yet he did them. And each one of them, if any one of them he hadn't done, he might have squelched this thing.
I remember it was columnist Mona Charen who observed that Watergate was the left lying in wait going back to the Hiss trial to get Nixon. And they finally rose up and grabbed their opportunity for revenge.
This is which trial, Charles, are you talking about?
The Hiss trial, going back to the trial of
Oh, yes.
1948.
Oh, yes.
Nixon was uncovered Alger Hiss, who was a doyen of the liberal establishment, as having been a Stalinist agent in the Roosevelt administration, leading to his imprisonment. So it was a terrible denouement for the left at the time, and Nixon began his career with that, and that they were waiting and lying in wait for revenge all the way up to Watergate. Just an
Well, that's right.
observation.
Nixon had made himself into something of a target of the left ever since the Hiss days. And he also did well politically on it. People
Oh
thought
yeah,
that he
he
was a
made his
great
career.
anti-communist, and he rode that one to the White House, really. So it sort of bit him in the end that he took these positions, and he was hated. And the irony of it is, even though he was hated by the left, it was actually the right, the military right, that distrusted him. And Nixon was actually a very moderate
He was.
president. If anything, he was ruled from the center. He put in price controls. That's anathema to a real
Yeah.
conservative.
Opened up
Uh,
China.
he, op- yeah, did China, did the SALT talks with Russia, uh, did a lot of things. Had Pat Moynihan working on a family assistance plan that was
Yeah.
really very, very advanced,
Sure, the
and so
EPA. I
forth.
mean, a lot of things. Nixon was probably more liberal than conservative, and yeah, I mean, I could see where that could have been the case. That's what did him in, and looking back at it, the whole thing does seem like a soft coup. It just eh, they wanted him out of office.
Well, they did, and but it was a long time coming for them to come around to realize what power they had in the press, with the Democrats and the press together to get rid of him. Once they did it, it was a big exciting bash, and everybody got on and bashed him. And it's that sort of excitement that
Oh
is
yeah,
generated, that sort of dancing around the campfire while your victim is burning at the stake. It's that kind of psychology which they tried on Trump. Now I have it on pretty good authority that even in journalism schools, professors were openly talking about how they would be Watergating Trump. This is a known template. Let's Watergate Trump. And they tried it and tried it. And finally, then they hit on Russiagate. And then when that failed, they hit on Ukraine Gate. And think about Ukraine, Charles. The Ukraine thing got going about 5 minutes after it was discovered about this phone call. Nobody thought about it. Nobody analyzed that call. Nobody really investigated whether Bidens were really into corruption. CNN immediately posted something on their screen that the Bidens were perfectly free of any kind of taint of corruption. I think they said there's no evidence of corruption. Well, I'm a prosecutor. Looks pretty darn corrupt to
yeah,
me.
exactly.
Billions of dollars of the United States going through Biden and Kerry's hands into the clients of young Biden and young Heinz, who was Kerry's son.
That's right.
So, but it happened. My point is, it happened 5 minutes after the call. Nobody analyzed what the politics were over there, whether an investigation was necessary. It's just boom,
It was,
let's
it was sort of
Watergate them.
it was sort of a Hail Mary pass to finish up the failed Mueller investigation and capitalize on some of the the investment in hysteria that had caused for 2 years. And it's really a disgrace that this would have happened like that in this country. It was, in a way, it was everything that Senator Joe McCarthy was about. That kind of demagoguery. Everybody is guilty and everyone is to blame, and they're all part of a conspiracy. When if anything, they were the ones who were conspiring, and it's amazing that Donald Trump was able to get through that. I mean, it's actually I'm amazed by how he deals with all this stuff.
Well, that's the funny thing about Trump. He of course is his own worst enemy in many ways by, of course, his bull in a china shop methods. But by the same token, you got to admire the guy. He
Yeah,
is not phased. He doesn't go off back in his corner like George W. Bush did. Finally, after 5 or 6 years, the poor guy just went back and said, "I give
he hid
up."
under his desk exactly.
But Trump keeps fighting every day. You got to give him that. I mean, I wince at a lot of the things the guy says, but I think he's on the right track. And he really, really has been done wrong by this. I mean, these are terrible. And think about McCarthy. We always talk about, oh, how McCarthy was such a
Mm.
terrible, terrible era. Well, what did McCarthy do? He basically shamed some people. There's no doubt. He yelled and screamed a lot, rarely gave out a name, but he made everybody somewhat paranoid and all that stuff. But he didn't prosecute anybody.
No,
He
and
didn't
most of the
ruin, you know,
his
whose
hearings are
lives
also.
did he ruin? The lives that were ruined by the blacklist were ruined before McCarthy came
Yeah.
along. He
No,
did not do
I'm
that.
just thinking about him because I just interviewed Larry Ty, who wrote a book called Demagogue about Joe McCarthy,
Yep.
and so that's on my mind. But as you say, John, I mean the Washington Post was able to patent political journalism as a result of the Watergate scandal, and advocacy journalism, which is really the very different than we assume journalism is, which is supposed to be an objective look at news and opinion and scandal and corruption. Yes, they have biases for sure, but the good journalist is supposed to put the biases in a context where they look at all sides of an issue and report on it. And that isn't what's happened since then. Since then, it's become more and more an open soapbox for political agendas, mostly on the left, but also on the right too. But the high ground is controlled by the liberal establishment, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the big networks on television. And their biases have become more and more blatant and more out front to the degree that now they don't even care.
Well, that's right. And one of the things that's happened as a result of Watergate is, and when I talk about the journalists being powers, they now feel that they have power themselves to pontificate on issues, to solve issues, to resolve issues. Mark Felt, Deep Throat, said he distrusted the press because they're shallow, superficial, and too quick to make judgments. However, in the old days, the press was more of a mediator and an interlocutor, even though they were not particularly savvy and they might have had bad judgment. But they relied more on experts in which they would say, well, Joe says this and Bob says that. And maybe they're slanted a little bit, but now you don't do that. Now you don't have reporting on Ukraine in which you have a responsible person from the right talking, a responsible person from the left, and the media is the mediator and interlocutor, the honest broker of that conversation. That does not happen because the media itself is the big power. Oh, they're the experts. So we turn on CNN and all these people are sitting around a table pontificating, and none of them really know what they're talking about, frankly, and they are very, very biased. I guess really it's not that they don't know what they're talking about, they're very biased is what I would say.
Well,
And
and
often,
President
though, they give short shrift to the real issues.
and President Trump has called them out on it. He's referred to it as fake news. He's mostly right about that. He may be a little thin-skinned on legitimate criticism, but for the most part, he has identified the problem. And their response to that has been to censor. I mean, they're taking stations off of YouTube. I mean, I'm worried that my station's going to get taken off if you say something that's not accepted by the clique that runs the place. I mean, it's gotten so bad that you can't mention the name of a certain drug that has been used to help cure COVID-19 because if you mention that name, you could lose your station. I mean, it's gotten that bad. Do you think that that's going to prevail? I mean, or do you think that President Trump will prevail?
Boy, it's going to go right down to the wire. This COVID thing has really thrown a haymaker at Trump. He's probably now helped, though, by I think by the riots and so forth, because people realize and the bad economy, they realize that this is just a bad deal. You're really going to trust Joe Biden to get us out of this hole? That's
Mm.
the best argument for Trump is Biden. Uh, but in terms of whether this continues to go on, I think in the media it is going to continue to go on. There is absolutely no end in sight that I can see. Someone asked me the other day whether it'd be a good idea if we allowed lawsuits against content providers, and I said, "My gosh, no. As soon as we start being able to sue platforms, they're already policing speech as it is, even though they have no liability because they're platforms. And I think it's going to be much worse if they are considered publisher and then can have an excuse to police uh, speech. So we don't need that. We don't need the thought police. We don't need the speech police. And I despair a little bit because it does seem, Charles, I don't know how conservatives get a voice on the national media. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's obviously very difficult now, and it's all gotten so negative. I mean, I'll just give one final example here that all three networks covered the nightly news is so negative about Trump, and that's what most people see. All three networks cover a major story that he ordered an extra scoop of ice cream at a diplomatic dinner. I mean, this is news. We're supposed to go, oh, that's horrible. I mean, it's gotten so trivial and so ridiculous. But anyway, John O'Connor, you're the author of Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and began today's partisan advocacy journalism. Excellent book. John, how do people get your book and how do they get information about you and other articles you're writing?
Right, right. Well, I would either go on postgatebook.com, my book site, which has a lot of the reviews of the book as well as my articles. I've probably got 25 or 30 op-eds on there. Or to amazon.com, which has the reviews and so forth. And I think what the people will find is they'll become tremendously educated on Watergate, but they'll also be educated on journalism as well. And that's what's so important about this,
Yes.
the intersection between the two.
Oh, it says everything about what's going on now. John, I
That's
want to
right.
thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Charles, it's been a blast. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. And John, I'll